We are evolutionarily adapted to deal with physical stressors. Two main things. It's letting go of hatred and it's replacing it with love. And when you forgive, you're using a coping mechanism that soothes that stress response. I can't have my negative reactions when somebody hurts me. Of course you can. You should feel those emotions. We've also got studies showing that forgiveness is related to better sleep. If your thought is leading you to productive solutions, then maybe you can continue to think and work on it, and that's just fine. If you're trying to forget that something bad happened to you, you're really working against nature. The number one predictor of health is social relationships, and forgiveness is a balm for social relationships.
In each episode, we dwell into the realms of wellness, exploring the latest trends, expert advice, and practical tips to help lead you a happy, healthier life. We aim to bring a broader perspective to our American audience on issues that impact your daily life by interviewing guests from the US and around the world. From nutrition and fitness to mental well-being and beyond, we're here to empower you with knowledge and inspiration. So whether you're looking to boost your energy, revamp your diet, or simply trying to find a balance in your lifestyle, you're at the right place. Join us as we embark on a journey towards a better, brighter you. I'm your host, Dr. Amir Khan, and together let's unlock the secrets to living life to its fullest.
Forgiveness, it isn't just an act of kindness. It's a game changer for your well-being. Science proves that letting go isn't about forgetting. It's about freeing yourself from stress, from anxiety, and any other negativity. It strengthens relationships, boosts resilience, and even enhances physical health. While some release past wounds easily, others wrestle with deep pain. But research reveals that everyday forgiveness is the key to lasting happiness and inner peace. Today, we explore the groundbreaking research uncovering the profound connections between forgiveness, health, and human spirit. Welcome to another episode of Khan Clinics. I'm your host, Dr. Amir Khan. Our guest today is Dr. Toussaint. He's a PhD. He's a psychology professor at Luther College, specializing in forgiveness research. He earned his PhD from University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in '98 and has consulted for Mayo Clinic and Cancer Treatment Centers of America. As an associate director of the Sierra Leone Forgiveness Project, he studies forgiveness as a tool for health, resilience, and well-being. He directs the laboratory for the investigation of mind, body, spirit that study virtues, but especially forgiveness and the relationship to health and well-being. He co-authored Forgiveness and Health, Scientific Evidence and Theories Relating Forgiveness to Better Health, and leads the Luther College Laboratory for the investigation of mind, body, and spirit. Dr. Lauren, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here today. This is going to be a great conversation.
We're looking forward to it. Thank you for being on the show. Let's start with the first question. We'd love to hear from you. What do you understand and how do you define forgiveness? And especially, how do you approach it as a science?
Yeah, those are great questions. I think most importantly, we have to accept that forgiveness is a bit of a loaded term and people have varying definitions of it. When you ask about the science of forgiveness, the scientists really do agree. It's been probably 25 or 30 years now that we've been studying forgiveness. scientifically. And we would agree that it really is comprised of two main things. That is, I'll try to be very simple here. It's letting go of hatred and it's replacing it with love. And there are many aspects to both of those things. Hatred has a way of impacting our emotions, obviously, but also our thoughts and our actions. And likewise, so does love. It impacts our whole being. And so it's really letting go of the terrible things that we think or want to do towards someone who hurt us and replacing those with much more love-based emotions and thoughts and feelings.
Excellent definition. I love it. Letting go of hatred and then replacing it with love. Your research suggests that forgiveness has a lot of implications. What are the effects do you see on the human body if we don't first forgive and or replace it with love?
Yeah, that's a great question too. The one thing that I think people often don't understand about forgiveness is that the person doing the forgiving is the person that has the most to gain. That often people believe that they're somehow offering, many benefits to the person that hurt them. And that's just not true. It may be true. There may be benefits to the person that hurt you of you forgiving them. But the thing that we know very clearly is that the forgiver, the person that has been hurt and is doing the forgiving, benefits, and they benefit in multiple areas. The first is it changes the way that your brain functions. Usually when somebody hurts us, it's very much almost indistinguishable from a physical insult or a hurt. And so we are kind of evolutionarily adapted to deal with physical stressors, someone that's reaching out to poke you in the eye or, smack you in the stomach or, whatever the case might be. The brain really interprets threat in a very unified way. And when someone hurts us, it interprets that as a threat. It causes a stress response. Most folks are familiar today with the components of the stress response, but just in brief, there are neuroendocrine, hormonal ramifications. There are physiological ramifications like blood pressure and activation of the sympathetic nervous system that drive the stress response. And when you forgive, you're using a coping mechanism that soothes that stress response. There's a lot of attention paid to things like stress relaxation, mindfulness, and other ways of coping or de-stressing. And forgiveness is oddly, I think, often not given much attention, even though various different estimates would claim that interpersonal stress is one of the most common forms that we face.
Excellent. Threat, you talk about hurt, threat, and you talk about the stresses, which is fascinating because it's biophysiological. You said blood pressure and stuff. You also mentioned the sympathetic drive that comes into being. Would you tell our audience how long can one, in your research and experience, hold on to some of the grudges, some of the stresses, and when does it sort of starts affect your mind, your body,
Mm-hmm.
etc.?
Mm-hmm.
So body has, you mentioned, a coping mechanism. Would you explain a little bit how long and when do you think, well, now it's the time you got to let go, you got to forgive or apply the tips or apply the science?
Yeah, so this is another thing that I think can easily be confused, that people might believe that they're entitled to some degree of wanting revenge, feeling angry, wanting to really engage those kind of negative reactions when we're hurt. And indeed, you are entitled to those things and should feel those things. But the changes that occur at a physical health level are almost instantaneous. That when someone hurts you and you perceive it as being threatening and stressful, your blood pressure almost instantaneously goes up. Physiological changes, activation of the sympathetic nervous system that's part of the fight and flight response happen almost instantaneously. Hormonal and neuroendocrine mechanisms kick into gear, maybe not instantaneously, but shortly thereafter. you have experienced some sort of offense or insult of some sort. Now, the interesting thing here is that I certainly don't want someone to think, oh my gosh, I can't have my negative reactions when somebody hurts me. Of course you can. You should feel those emotions. You should spend time experiencing the anger that you have, the sense of injustice that you might have. But as soon as you're ready, and the sooner the better, as soon as you can start thinking about at least considering forgiveness, the sooner you start to recover from that experience. And I think the research on smoking is a really good example here, that someone can smoke for years and years and years, and the day they quit, their body starts to heal. And that's similar in ways to the way that unforgiveness is going to do nothing but drive up your stress response and cause your physical body to struggle. But the moment you decide to forgive, you're going to start engaging some of those reparative mechanisms. And we've seen this in research that shows very clear changes in functioning of the brain, in functioning of the peripheral nervous system that connects the brain to the rest of our body, and in terms of just our overall functioning, our overall health and well-being.
Excellent. Thank you for explaining that. So, in your research, the sooner you start doing it, that's the time when the healing sort of starts from within. And letting go of it as soon as possible is your recommendation, because then you're on a different path.
Yeah, I want to be sure to be clear here. I don't want to press anyone into forgiveness. This is an experience that comes when the time is right for you. It's difficult to sit with negative emotions sometimes, but that's the very thing that we need to do. We need to be authentic in our experience. We don't want to try to cover up our negative emotions or dismiss them or just not pay attention to them. Oftentimes, negative emotions are a signal that something wrong, that there is something wrong, and that we need to, try to maybe seek out a way to fix it. And so those are all important things. And I certainly wouldn't want to sound overly prescriptive about forgiveness. It needs to come when the time is right. My hope is that it will come sooner rather than later. I mean, the effects of stress are usually accumulated over time. And if the time that we're talking about is a few weeks, we probably don't need to worry about the negative emotions and their impact. But if the time required is something like a few years or a decade or two, it may have undue negative effects on our well-being.
So you don't want it to be procrastinated. And
Yeah.
tell our audience, are there any cues when you start to say, hey, it's now impacting your quality of life, it's impacting you in any negative way? Now probably is the time to sit down and contemplate about forgiveness, and then from there onwards, other cues.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear. When we are hurt by other people, it's often on our mind. And if you take a simple example, one that I use often because people can relate to it, if you're cut off in traffic and somebody, kind of makes a rude gesture or, honks rudely and kind of drives erratically or aggressively in your direction, that's often something that sticks with you, right? That's you might come into work that day and you might be a little bit upset and short with your colleagues, and sometimes we'll say to each other things like, I'm sorry, I just had a really bad commute today. I got cut off by 2 or 3 people and they all kind of shook their fist at me, and that probably subsides fairly quickly. And
Sure.
we know that some research that has been done looking at the time course of forgiveness suggests that oftentimes forgiveness does it does arrive fairly quickly, and it does work in kind of a natural way to help us recover from those kinds of things. However, if this is the kind of thing that really gets stuck for you, and the term we'd often use is what we call rumination. And if you're ruminating on this thing, perhaps not just all day, but sometimes all night, we've also got studies showing that forgiveness is related to better sleep. And we know how important sleep is for our overall physical health and our mental health for that matter. But when you're ruminating on something and you just can't let go of it, and the signal that I oftentimes try to suggest is useful for people is, if it's the last thing you think about at the end of the day, and if it's the first thing you think about at the beginning of the day, you're probably ruminating on it and you're probably thinking about it too much. Now, one way that people oftentimes used, or one approach to deciding if this is a critical signal for you, is if you're ruminating on something and you're thinking about it a lot, sometimes that's because it's a really complicated thing and you need to kind of work out the issues. If your thought is leading you to productive solutions, then maybe you can continue to think and work on it, and that's just fine. But if your thought is just leading you to really negative emotions in a place where it's really not good for you, then that's a signal that this is probably a hurt or an offense that is really hard for you to deal with. And you probably need to think about a different way of coping with it. Forgiveness is not the only way to cope with being hurt, but it's a very productive way of coping with it.
Dr. Lauren, I think that's an excellent point. I'm sort of captivated by how you phrased rumination, and then you went right to the night, and then you pointed out, well, if you are getting ticked and you're sleeping with it or waking up with it, or it's affecting your sleep in any way, being a sleep physician, I see that a lot. There's something that is not right. And thank you for identifying that, because that's sort of like a key moment in your life. Your body, like you said, you have to forgive to heal, but you have to sleep to heal as well. And it's such a balance act to do that. And you probably just nailed it absolutely right bang on in terms of giving our audience something to think about and contemplating on. I want to just go on the same topic a little bit and just extend it and ask you about two questions that come in. The first question is, do we always have to forget? Is forgetfulness a part of forgiveness? And is it sort of like a necessary tool? What's your take on this?
Yeah, so I get this question quite often, and the simple answer is you do not have to forget to forgive. In fact, it's probably a very normal thing to forget about something that has really hurt you. And in fact, we might say, if you were capable of simply forgetting about it, you wouldn't need to forgive it, because you just kind of delete it from your experience and it would never bother you again.
Yeah.
But that's not how we're built. Generally, our understanding of human memory is such that the negative experiences have a way of really kind of being emblazoned into our memory. And there's lots of reasons for that, some of them protective and adaptive and based in survival. But the bottom line is that if you're trying to forget that something bad happened to you, you're really working against nature. My suggestion would be that you remember it a different way, and that is to be able to remember what happened, but instead of being enraged by your memory, which activates the stress response, hopefully you can move to a place eventually where you can remember what happened, but do it at very least in a kind of neutral space. And maybe eventually you can even move to remembering it in a more positive way.
So your take on is that you don't have to, Amir, forget. You're suggesting something, sublimating it with something positive, and trying to see it from a different perspective than normally what you are used to see, and that's bringing in that intense positivity when you are truly forgiving. Would that be part of the answer?
Yeah, I think so. I think you've hit on a number of key issues there. That we all have our story, but oftentimes it has to kind of be rewritten for us to. We have to keep revising our story, or we kind of don't grow. And so, to think that you're going to forget very significant pieces of your story is just not practical, right? You're going to remember this. In fact, remembering it is kind of the starting place, right? That's why I need to forgive, because I can't forget it. And, trying to do so is just unnatural. Yeah. Working through it in a way that maybe helps you, maybe through empathy or through other mechanisms, compassion or sympathy for your offender, that's a very helpful approach to thinking about the fact that you can't forget it, right? So I would actually say the healthiest forgiveness is remembering very clearly and objectively what happened, but being able to re-experience or remember it in a way that doesn't lead you to a very, very negative place.
Another question that's been brought to our attention, I want to put it out to you, it may be a little bit off topic, is that about revenge and forgiveness and revenge, sort of like on the opposite spectrum. Is there any role for revenge? Is the question. And what's your take? Please ask Dr. Lauren about what's his take about revenge, and what would he advise someone who's stuck with the idea of, oh, I got to take revenge, and that's the sort of necessary step before I start to, even if it's trivial.
Yeah. I mean, so some of the research here that kind of comes out of an evolutionary perspective suggests that revenge is, it feels good. It's a rewarded kind of response and behavior in humans, and not just in humans, in other animals as well. Unfortunately, if the only solution was revenge, oftentimes that would mean that we would do things that would hurt our group's ability to survive. And so there must be something beyond revenge, and that something is forgiveness, right? That we have to eventually find a place where we can move forward together, given the importance of social cohesion and the community for our adaptability and survival over the years. There has to be something else. I would suggest that while revenge is almost always destructive, it almost always returns pain for pain. And in thinking about forgiveness, what we'd like to be able to do is to absorb pain and return some form of loving response. But I would suggest this, that there is a place for justice. That's not always revenge, right? Justice can sometimes mean that the kind of the balance in life is returned. Take a very simple example. Let's say you steal $100 from me, and then I find out and you pay me back. You might even pay me back $150. That is just, right? That's an appropriate response. You've kind of repaid what you stole and then offered another gift in hopes that I might, repair the relationship and so forth. There's nothing wrong with justice, and it doesn't always have to be what you might think of as a kind of revenge-based justice, what we call a retributive justice, gaining retribution. I would encourage seeking justice always, right? That's an important part of a civil society and living in a productive, community. That can take many forms, and it can support forgiveness, although the two are largely independent, because people can be forgiving without justice. They can also get justice with never forgiving. So they don't go hand in hand, but it is possible that if you get justice, it might support your wanting to forgive. And so while I'm not a big fan of revenge, as you might not be surprised to find, I think there's kind of a subtext to the question, is there a place for making things right? And absolutely there is. A good apology, a good attempt at restitution those are very strong predictors of someone who's actually going to forgive. So yeah, I would encourage those things.
Excellent. So I love the part, Dr. Lauren, where you said revenge is pain for pain, and it's a destructive course generally. It's when we think of revenge, and then you said, well, seeking justice, balancing life, those are important ingredients to balance out the revenge part of things. I'm just going to move on to another question that's probably relevant, and that is remorse. You just briefly touched on an apology and stuff. How would you amalgamate or incorporate, hey, forgiveness and remorse, and you're not seeing remorse, or are you seeing remorse? And you still got to balance out the two acts together. How do you feel regarding that? And in the context of someone saying, oh, I've left the offender off the hook. That's what I'm seeing here. I'm just reading out what's been written. What does your
Yeah.
research say, and how do you overcome this mindset? What would you suggest?
Yeah, well, so I'll take the second part of the question first. That is, if you believe what you're doing is letting the offender off the hook by forgiving, then you have what I would call a different view of forgiveness than I do. And the point here is that I would certainly encourage the seeking of justice and repair. But even if you don't get that, you're not just necessarily letting somebody off the hook if you forgive them. All you're really doing, let's say there's no way for them to pay you back. Maybe there's something has happened that they can't repair. They've broke something that can now no longer be fixed, right? And if that happens and you're still able to forgive them, what you've done is not so much let them off the hook, but you've let yourself off the hook, so that you're no longer saddled with the anger and the stress and the tension toward that person. You are now in a place of peace where, granted, things may never be just, they may not be balanced, but you can live with it in a much better way. So I don't see forgiveness as letting someone off the hook. It's really about what I'm doing with myself internally. Now, often that my forgiveness of someone who has hurt me, it is often the case that it is much easier to forgive if someone apologizes, but that apology has to be sincere. We just did a study in which we looked at three groups: people that were hurt, and people who were hurt and got an apology, or they got an insincere apology. And one thing that we know is that if you're going to apologize, but it's not a sincere apology, you might as well not bother. The apology has to come from the offender's heart. And often, often when we apologize, we don't put ourselves in the kind of place of the person we hurt. So if I'm apologizing to you, Dr. Khan, I think, well, I should just be able to say, I'm sorry, that won't happen again. And that'll be fine. But you, as a victim of my hurt, often want much more than that, right? You want an expression of real remorse, like, I feel terrible about what I did. You must think awfully of me. In fact, you probably, want to do something to hurt me. I understand that. I'm so terribly sorry. How can I make this up to you? And even, beyond that, not just make it up to you, but what can I do in addition to show that I really, truly value our relationship and that I love you as a human being, right? And I also want to promise you that I will never do this to you again, right? Those are the things that would make for a really solid apology, would hopefully then, prompt you to want to forgive.
Brilliant. That was brilliant. So I just want to go back to the last point where you broke down the apology component. And you first of all acknowledged that I've hurt you. I understand that you're in pain. I understand that you may even want to take, it's like a revenge sort of thing. I did something terrible, so you acknowledge that. And then you mention, how can I make it up to you? And then you did that little commitment at the end where you said, oh, I want to promise that I won't do this again. So you tied everything up and reassured the other person. And that was that's sort of like a proper full apology, with the context of understanding the problem, acknowledging it, and then committing on another path, and then promising as well. So thank you for explaining that. That was really excellent. You mentioned your research, and you said that you had three groups, and you had one with hurt and apology, and the second was a hurt and insincere apology, and then there was a group that was hurt with no apology at all. Is that right?
Correct.
So what was sort of like the outcome of that? What was the findings?
Yeah. So we were measuring revenge, another piece of the kind of hurt response that goes very closely with revenge is avoidance. Typically, we don't want to be around people who have hurt us. And then a third piece is what we call kind of benevolent intent. So you're intending to do well toward the person, not harm. all three of those things tend to work together. And so we tend to just kind of maybe sometimes refer to them simply as forgiveness motivations or forgiveness. And what we found is that for people who got an apology that was sincere, it erased the offense. It was they looked like people who were not offended, and we did have a group that was simply not offended. And so we had kind of a control group, and the people who got an apology that was sincere looked just like the control. They looked like they hadn't been offended in the first place, and that's how powerful apology is. People who were offended without apology, they did not do well. They were not forgiving at all. They had lots of revenge, lots of avoidance, very little benevolence. And people who got an insincere apology looked like the people who were offended and got no apology at all, right? That's where I was kind of saying, like, if you're gonna apologize insincerely, you might as well not bother, because it's invisible. It's invisible to your to the people that you've hurt or offended. They don't trust it. They don't believe that you're truly remorseful, and their reactions, they bear the evidence of that.
Excellent.
This was in the workplace, where oftentimes, things happen in the workplace, and we do have to apologize to our coworkers sometimes. And if you're looking for productivity and a good workplace community, this is a crucial feature.
Excellent. So apology has a big role in this. You think that or the word is a sincere, properly formatted apology.
Yeah.
Thank you for explaining that. Dr. Lauren, in your book, Forgiveness and Health, Scientific Evidence and Theories Relating Forgiveness to Better Health, you've discussed the scientific proofs behind the forgiveness. Tell us a little bit about what's your most surprising finding regarding the research, and what would you like to relate to our audience here to go have a look at the book and see what it talks about?
Sure. Two things that surprised me after collecting all of the information that went into that volume. The first is people, I think the average person is very confused about what forgiveness is. And because of that, the most significant hurdle in the process is just kind of clearly understanding what you're being asked to do. And if you believe that forgiveness is essentially reconciliation, say, for example, like, I forgive you, now we have to be good friends again, that's not necessarily true. Forgiveness is just, I am going to put away my hatred, try to develop at least some sense of neutrality, and maybe, if I'm lucky, as the days pass by, a more positive view of the person that hurt me. And that doesn't mean I have to be friends with that person again. It just means that I've kind of managed to find forgiveness and peace. But many, many folks are confused. They think forgiveness is sort of the doormat response. Like, I just let people walk all over me. My friends and relatives don't have to respect me. I'm just condoning or excusing or explaining bad behavior in ways that are unproductive. So that's one thing that's kind of surprising. I think today, in our current day, most people understand stress, right? Even the average person walking around on the street, after about 100 years of research on stress, maybe 125 years, or depending on what you point to as this beginning time of stress research, it has had wonderful traction in the general population, in the kind of just your typical community of people. This is not true. Now, we're still at a much earlier state of the research and the practice regarding forgiveness, but it is the case that I think people are still very confused about it. So that's kind of surprising to me. Number two, perhaps most surprising, is how broad, how all-encompassing forgiveness is. It changes everything from your head to your toes. I mean, your brain starts to work in different ways as you become a more forgiving person. It allows you to kind of move past things in life that would otherwise bog you down. It changes your perspective and your outlook. It leads to things like having greater hope and gratitude and optimism. It impacts your physiology, your neurological function, immunological function, your overall physical health and well-being. Things like chronic pain, and chronic illnesses, the way that we cope with them, all of these things are improved. It has perhaps its most impactful effects on mental health, things like depression, anxiety, trauma symptoms, all of those things, rumination that leads to lots of mental health problems. And perhaps at the broadest level, it has a really positive and wonderful effect on our social relationships. It allows us to continue to maintain bonds between people that are absolutely crucial. In one of the more recent Harvard studies of, I think, about 75 years in length, the number one predictor of health is social relationships. And forgiveness is a balm for social relationships. It helps us maintain social ties that are so crucially important. And this leads us to, at the grandest level, better experiences of life satisfaction and overall kind of meaningful happiness, what Aristotle called eudaimonic happiness, that is beyond just feeling good. It's finding true meaning, purpose, and value in your life.
Excellent. That was really good. It was really fascinating how you talk about all encompassing effect. And you mentioned how impactful forgiveness is, whether it's physiological, metabolic, anesthetic, mental, and how you phrased the social relationship part, how you emphasized on why is it so important that you have a body and a mind that has the capability of forgiving, because
Yeah.
that gives a true inner meaning, which I found very fascinating, because people are often asking about this: how do I find my true meaning, and how do I, and then you tied it in with the social relationship, and then you tied it with forgiveness. So, and if we're holding on to guys, that was a very fascinating point, and thank you for explaining that. It was really good. I just want to ask my last question, and I want you to tell us a couple of things very quickly. You're the director of the Sierra Leone Forgiveness Project. We would be love to know what sort of projects you're involved in right now. That's part of one question. Two, is there any role of AI? That comes as a very common question. How is AI influencing this? What should we look at the future? And how should we see forgiveness being impacting the future of generation, especially when times and everything's are changing drastically? And then lastly, your message.
Yeah. So Sierra Leone is a great test case. It at one time was known as having the bloodiest civil war on the continent of Africa, and that is really saying something for anyone that knows the history of Africa. It really, to me, served as the most, to use a scientific term that maybe comes from chemistry, it was the acid test for me, because I felt like if people in Sierra Leone could benefit from forgiveness, then I should be able to benefit from it too. And many of the people around me, friends and family, should. And sure enough, that's exactly what we found, that we taught forgiveness to folks in Sierra Leone. We continue to do that today. It started as a very small grassroots effort in a local school in Freetown, the capital city of Sierra Leone, and today it's grown internationally out of the work that we've done there, the work that we do around the world on forgiveness and trying to help people, especially in really terribly conflicted situations. You mentioned AI, and I'm really glad that you asked that question, because the American Psychological Association has been, for lack of a better term, struggling with the idea that mental health needs are far outpacing our ability to meet them. And as a doctor yourself, Dr. Khan, I'm sure you can relate to the access issues involved in healthcare today. One of the solutions that's been proposed is that forgiveness should be disseminated more as a public health intervention, as opposed to more of a kind of one-on-one therapy kind of environment. AI certainly has a role here, because I think this might be an important point, and that is, for people who are struggling to forgive, it might not be the case that you need all the answers to the forgiveness test. What you need is how to ask the right questions about this circumstance that you're in. It may not be the case that you will know how to forgive, but if you can ask, how can I possibly see why someone did this to me? And that's a question that you can kind of formulate, that maybe even there's a list of the top 10 questions to ask when you've been hurt. And you can go to a source like AI, and it can provide you with exercises that are essentially aimed at developing empathy. This could be very helpful, right? We do not necessarily need to have a therapist in the room instructing you on every possible way to develop empathy, but you have to
Fascinating.
ask that question. And so I think that's a crucial thing. We also have, my colleagues and I have many different tools available. We have a short workbook we call Restore the Journey to Self-Forgiveness. Lots of people struggle to forgive themselves. This is a very short workbook, but it points people in directions of reflection, meditation, or prayer that can help them get past the things that they perceive as being kind of injustices that they've committed on behalf of others. And so there's a role for AI, for the internet, for dissemination on broad scale, right? Because I think that if you're trying to fix this problem individually, one-on-one, without changing communities, it's not probably going to work, and it's not going to have much impact overall. That brings me to my last, and my message would be this. Forgiveness has incredible benefits, but often we think of them as only being the domain of the individual. The forgiveness benefits to the individual are easily highlighted, but it has benefits in the family, for couples, married or romantic couples. It has benefits for friends. It has benefits at work, in the broader community, and in nations. And I think if there's two things that I want to highlight, one is we are living in a time in which isolation, loneliness, and conflict and divisiveness are at all-time highs. I think many historians could look back and say, yeah, there were times in which we had, really significant conflict. We are certainly in a time in which we rival those points in history. Given the epidemic levels, perhaps pandemic levels of loneliness, the ability to preserve relationships and the ability to see a way through conflict that does not end in sheer tit for tat injury and pain, I think is perhaps honestly our only way forward. The You can see, as we try to extract the two parties from the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we have to find a way where both sides are going to realize they'll never find a suitable solution where each of them feels perfectly justified in what they've done and what they've received. There's going to have to be some level of forgiveness that's involved in these level of conflicts. That's on kind of a nation and state level. There also has to be an embrace of forgiveness at the very personal, couples level, family level, friend and community level. We've done work on community level forgiveness, and it can change people. When you approach a community and say, we're going to do everything we can to try to cherish the experience of forgiveness in this community, it changes folks. They become less depressed, less anxious, they flourish more. It does wonderful things. So I think I think if anything, I want to shine a light on forgiveness at all of its levels, and especially given the context we're in, the place that we are in as a world, as a state of humanity. I think if we really think about what our hope is in, it has to be in some part in forgiveness.
Absolutely brilliant. Absolutely. I just want to highlight a couple of the things you said about AI getting involved, helping with the therapy part, giving us exercises and interacting with it. I'm glad that you are one of those who is encompassing the AI and looking a role beyond for a psychologist or a psychotherapist and stuff. So appreciate that, because this embracing that technology is very important. And I think you just wonderfully put it, there's still going to be role for you or other people to try to modify and what the exercises are. So thank you
Sure.
for answering that question. And then the last bit was really brilliant. I think where you discussed how we are so isolated, yet in a very busy world, social media and everything around us, but yet we are still so isolated, and we're beginning to lose that art of relationships. And and especially when you mentioned about conflicts, very easy to start and then pulling them out and trying to get a resolution, how difficult it is, and forgiveness, and you pointed that out. We could disagree on how someone's going about and doing it, but we got to applaud how probably politically our leadership is now trying to stop the war at all costs. And I want to give a little bit of credit to our president for that reason, especially to trying to resolve this issue. No matter how they're doing it, whatever the implications are, it is powerful. And I think it's very important that we acknowledge that as well. Absolutely brilliant. And thanks to our amazing audience. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Khan Clinics. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. Give us a thumbs up. Hit the subscribe button and feel free to drop your comments. You know we love hearing from you. Don't forget to spread the word. Tell your friends about us.